A tour of the Leidesdorff land grant from 1844 in Sacramento County. Out here on the American River, and just a couple hundred yards east and to the south was the northern point of Leidesdorff's land grant. He received a tract of land from the Mexican government in 1844. It was described as being 4 leagues in width from east to west and 2 leagues in depth from north to south, with the American River being the northern boundary. A league is about 2.6 miles. And of course, California became a state after it was acquired by the United States after the Mexican-American War. And in the treaty, Guadalupe Hidalgo Treaty, Mexican and Spanish land grants were private property. So the Leidesdorff Rancho Rio de los Americanos was kind of in dispute in terms of where the boundaries were going to be, because there was a whole bunch of gold miners and other entrepreneurs that wanted public land. They did not want to have to negotiate with a Mexican land grant. So today I'm going to be doing a tour where we go and see the different points of this Leidesdorff land grant and talk a little bit about the disputes and the litigation. And it took a good solid 10 years from 1854 to 1864 before the land grant boundaries were officially recognized in the Hayes Survey. In 1843, John Bidwell and John Sinclair actually rode this section of what was to become Sacramento County, looking at a potential land grant for Nathan Spear. William Alexander Leidesdorff, whose primary residence was in San Francisco, did apply for the grant of land from the Mexican government, and it was awarded to him in 1844. Now, the hard line of the boundary is the Sutter land grant to the east. And there was an oak tree up on the bluff there, and that denoted to the east was the Rancho Rio de los Americanos, and to the west was Sutter's land grant. And from that oak tree, 2 leagues south was the western boundary. And then you went up the American River for the northern boundary, and that's where things got a little different for people in terms of looking at all the land that it might encompass. Now, Leidesdorff hired Willard Buzzell to run cattle on his rancho. Right up around the corner, he built a little adobe house. Buzzell says that they had about 500 cattle, about 175 sheep, and 50 horses, and he ran that and managed the ranch operations from about 1845 to 1847. And of course, the war had started and everything. And he took the cattle as far up, up towards where we now know what is Folsom. So that was kind of an indication early on of where this land grant extended. And if you look at the description of the land grant, it says the eastern portion of Leidesdorff's tract was the Lomerias, the low hills. And that came into dispute later on. What are low hills and where do they start? Leidesdorff died in 1848. Right as the gold rush was getting underway. Captain Folsom, Joseph Libby Folsom, who was down in San Francisco and saw all of the property that Leidesdorff owned, was able to secure the ownership to the Leidesdorff estate. And that's a whole other story how he got that. I'm just focusing on the land grant. And beginning in 1849, Folsom was in charge of the Rancho Rio de los Americanos, but it was pretty much referred to also as the Leidesdorff land grant. From the American River, straight south, 2 leagues, 5.2 miles, you'll be a couple hundred yards to the west of Bradshaw Road, south of Elder Creek, and right out there in that field is the southern terminus, the very furthest southern point of the Leidesdorff land grant. Now, California becomes a state in 1850, and they set up the Board of Land Commissioners to look at all of the Mexican and Spanish land grants. Because under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Mexican and Spanish land grants were private property and were to be acknowledged and recognized by the United States. But what were the boundaries? Where were they at? And was the title even good? So the Board of Land Commissioners started looking at the Leidesdorff land grant in 1854, and they took testimony from all sorts of different people, including Bidwell and Sutter and Buzzell, to find out where this land grant was. But they also saw the description, and they had to live with the description. The northern boundary being the American River, 2 leagues to the south, and the southern border was to mirror the meanderings of the American River. Of course, civil engineers, they don't like to make curved linear shapes. They want lines. They want hard lines with exact angles. So what the Board of Land Commissioners decided to do is they were going to kind of modify the southern border. First, bring that line down 2 leagues, and then they made a 46-degree angle to the northeast. Because if you look at the American River, that's what the American River, the course of the American River was doing, is it was moving back and forth. The first map that was drawn and submitted, one of the maps was from John Sinclair, and he was not a map maker, and his American River diagram looked more east-west. But as land commissioners knew, that's not the way the American River flowed, but that was a point of contention for people that opposed the expansive Leidesdorff land grant boundaries to the east. So now we'll go up and look at that 46-degree line up about 5 miles. So the Board of Land Commissioners had that southern boundary line come up 46-degree angle to the northeast and hit just right about this spot here. And then the boundary was a straight line to the east for about 3.1, 3.2 miles. And again, that would mirror kind of a east to west portion of the American River. Now, some of the people who opposed the outlines of the Leidesdorff land grant, Rancho Rio de los Americanos, was Amos Catlin. Amos Catlin was president of the Natoma Water and Mining Company, and his water canals, his water ditches, the Natoma ditch, came into Sacramento County in and around the Folsom area. And the Leidesdorff land grant was private property, and if his canals went onto that, you know, he was going to have to do something. Now, Folsom, Captain Folsom, actually had a preliminary map made in 1850 that showed the eastern boundary intersecting with the American River right at about Negro Bar. And of course, Negro Bar was where the town of Folsom eventually was to be built as the terminus of the Sacramento Valley Railroad that Captain Folsom was involved with. But if that eastern boundary to his property that he now owned, that Leidesdorff land grant, went that far, Amos Catlin and the Natoma Water Company had some issues. And even early on, there was talk of, Amos, your canals are on the land grant. You either pay us rent and a portion of the water sales, or you buy the property. And Amos Catlin was an attorney, and so he knew there was going to be issues. So he was an opponent of that expanded eastern boundary and argued before the court as counsel for the interveners and property owners in that area against what would become the Hayes Survey. And the Hayes Survey, John, he was the Surveyor General, John Hayes, took all of the descriptions of the Board of Land Commissioners and with their points and created a map of the Leidesdorff or the Rio de los Americanos land grant, and that occurred in about 1855, so people could see how far that eastern boundary went that way. So let's go to the next stop. At this spot, the land commissioners decided that the boundary would make a 29-degree angle to the northeast, again to follow the course of the American River. And you can see, well, there was a road here that was called Americanos, and you can see the backs of those homes. That line is the land grant. Now, this particular spot here, if you were to go due north, would intersect with Alder Creek as it flowed into the American River. And many people, including Amos Catlin, proposed that was really the eastern boundary. That is where the Lomerias started, the low hills. They looked around here and said, these are low hills. Other people disagreed with them. And one of the issues is this is not 4 leagues from the Sutter land grant. It is not 10.4 miles. That's 10.4 miles, 4 leagues is further east. And so that was an issue. However, the Board of Land Commissioners did a lot of work, and they did all the testimony, and they concluded these were the measurements, these were the intersections that provided 8 square leagues of land, about 36,000 acres, of the land grant. And of course, Folsom died in 1855. So it was now his executors, which was Halleck, Peachy, and Van Winkle, that were pushing forward and presenting evidence before the Board of Land Commissioners. And they determined, okay, this is going to be the map. The Hayes Survey is going to be what we have. That is going to be the Leidesdorff land grant, the Rancho Rio de los Americanos. And in 1856, because Folsom had died, now that town, Granite City, was named in his honor, Folsom, the probate court was now involved, and they looked at what the Board of Land Commissioners was doing. They hadn't, officially published the Hayes Survey yet, but they said, everything looks good. Go ahead and sell your lots in Folsom. And Amos Catlin bought lots of lots. He bought lots in 1856 and again in 1857. I believe he owned about 20 blocks of downtown Folsom. So as the term goes, he acquiesced to the borders, the boundaries that the land commissioners had set up. And his water canals encroached on the land grant. And he didn't really want to pay rent, didn't want to split up the flow of the sales, so he bought 9,600 acres of the Leidesdorff land grant from the executors, Folsom's executors, for $36,400, I believe it was. So he owned a significant chunk of the land grant, and he did that in March 1858. September 1858. The Secretary of Interior said, I don't like that map. Draw a new one. And he gave orders for Survey General Mandeville to develop a new map where the boundary came to about this spot here. Now, Amos had been one of the biggest opponents of this expansive view, but now he had purchased so much land, he was all in, he had to defend the Hayes Survey and everything that went into defining the boundaries of the Leidesdorff land grant. Well, on the Hayes survey, the boundary line came up at a 29-degree angle, 5.87 miles, and hit the very most eastern edge of the land grant and went due north to the American River. On the other side of the little ravine over there would have been Prairie City. Now, of course, that was all thrown in the air because the Secretary of Interior said, oh, we need to have a new survey and order the Mandeville survey. Now, however, in 1860, Congress passed an act that gave U.S. District Court judges more flexibility and authority in review process over these land grant applications and maps. And Amos Catlin and Augustus K. Thompson, who had been on the Board of Land Commissioners, argued against this Mandeville survey and said, hey, Judge Ogden Hoffman, you have the power to make a decision. And the judge did look at the Mandeville survey, and he looked at this Hayes survey that had been entered into the records in 1857, and he said, that Mandeville survey, no, that's not gonna work. Gotta throw that one out. The Hayes survey is nice, but I'm not crazy about that one either. Let's do a new survey. Yeah, so this is 1861 and everyone's going, another survey? So Amos and his co-counsel got together and petitioned for a new hearing for Judge Ogden Hoffman to reconsider this new survey that he was proposing. Now, the judge, he wanted like a rectangle land grant. He liked that because this Hayes survey and what the Board of Land Commissioners, it was more like a parallelogram. But the Hayes survey was true to, as best as they can tell, some of the Mexican government decisions on how they looked at land boundaries going from a water source. And at this point, even though we're kind of north of Sutter's land grant, it's 10.4 miles. And there's these lomerias start here. There are these low foothills. Also within the Hayes survey were 8 leagues of land, 8 square leagues. So we have 4 times 2, that's 8. And so this Hayes survey that the Land Commission put together met all of the conditions. The American River is the northern boundary. We have 8 leagues of land, 35,000 acres, and the southern border mirrored the course of the American River as best it could. Was it perfect? No. But Amos and so many men had already invested in this land grant that they had to keep pushing for the Hayes survey, and they did. So from the Prairie City point, the Hayes survey eastern boundary of the Leidesdorff land grant came up and hit the American River about half a mile north of Folsom Dam on the American River, and that was below the confluence of the South Fork and North Fork, and about a mile west of Mormon Island, where Amos Catlin had begun his mining career in 1849. Judge Ogden Hoffman granted Catlin and Thompson's request to reconsider his order for a whole new survey. And Catlin methodically put down all the arguments and presented them in court. And one of the big arguments he made that was dismissed earlier were about the people who had already bought property from the Folsom estate in the land grant, Amos being one of them, over 9,000 acres. But of course, there was all those people in Folsom. And if a new survey was to be done, and that eastern boundary moved west, maybe closer to Alder Creek, all of the people that had their land purchased, it was all going to be thrown into disarray because they went from land grant property to public lands. So they'd have to get and also the land grant needed to include 8 square leagues of land, which meant that the southern boundary had to be pushed down further. You couldn't do anything with the western boundary because that was up against Sutter's land grant. And people had already bought public, U.S. public land south of the land grant. And now, if a new survey pushed that southern boundary, those people would now be in the land grant, and then they'd have to have their U.S. public lands nullified. Just a mess. And the judge looked at the totality of everything and said, okay, if this was a new question, I would like to see a land grant in a rectangular form. But the land grant has, the land commissioners have done their due diligence and created a survey as best they could. And he said, that stands. That was 1862. The U.S. Attorney General was almost obligated to appeal Judge Hoffman's decision. They weren't necessarily thrilled with it, but they had to do it. And so the next step was the U.S. Supreme Court. And the man who knew the most about the history of the Leidesdorff land grant, Rio de los Americanos, who was against it to begin with, and then a proponent and a defender, was Amos Catlin. So in 1863, Amos traveled back to Washington, D.C. to argue before the U.S. Supreme Court. In 1864, they came down with a ruling that said, yeah, the Hayes survey is good. There's no reason to change anything. And by the end of the 1860s, most of the land within the Leidesdorff land grant had been sold to settlers and other people. And that's kind of the history. It took a long time for that land grant to move through all of the different court systems and it being flopped back and forth. And Amos Catlin actually wrote a couple books in terms of, just the history of the land grant litigation and his arguments before the U.S. Supreme Court. And that's where I pulled most of all of this information from. So if you have any questions about it, you can leave comments down below. I'll do the research and see if I can't come up with an answer. Otherwise, I hope you've enjoyed this little tour of a Mexican land grant in Sacramento County and along the American River. So for history, I'm Kevin Canals.